May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts, may they be acceptable. May they be pleasing in thy sight, O Lord, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Who would like to have more joy in their lives? Some of you are all set, it looks like. Okay. There are those of us that would like to have more joy. So this is one of the tough questions that was presented for us to consider. Someone said, I usually start the day cup half full, and by the end of the day, I've spent enough time with people that have cup half empty, and so I find myself drained. How do I have joy in the midst of all of this? It's a very valid question in light of everything that's going on in our world. So let's examine this quality of life called joy. What I'd like for us to do this morning is maybe reverse engineer it. Kind of like a formula. How many of you like math? Sean, you like math, don't you? All right. So we're gonna see a formula for joy that comes out of the scriptures. First, there is the factor of happiness. Happiness. And oftentimes, happiness is often confused with joy. That oftentimes we think that happiness is joy and joy is happiness. Therefore, if I'm not happy, then I don't have joy. And it's just a factor. Happiness is just one factor of happiness. It's just one factor of joy. You see, happiness needs more added to it in order to actually become joy. The psalmist says, happy is the one whose delight is in the law of the Lord, that meditates upon God day and night, on God's ways. And we ask ourselves, well, what exactly are God's ways? Let's keep it simple. Micah said, "You've shown us what is good and what the Lord requires of us, to do justice, to love loving kindness, to walk humbly in God's ways." Jesus doubles down on this happiness, and he takes it in a direction that nobody could see coming. He said, happy are you who mourn. Happy are you who hunger and thirst for justice in this world. Happy are you who are struggling to make peace a reality. Happy are you who are knocked down, dragged around because of making justice happen in this world. Happy are you when people grind you down because you find your happiness in doing loving kindness, because you're my apprentice, Jesus says. Yes, these are the marks of happiness. Mourning, humiliation, thirst, physical, emotional abuse at the hands of the world. These are not usually what the world offers to us as the marks of happiness, are they? No. He turns it on its head. And that brings us to the other factor, to the formula for joy. Yes, happiness is part of it, but there is an element of joy that is heartbreak. Now, oftentimes, we don't think of heartbreak as a component of joy, but it's there because Jesus shows us that we cannot have joy without heartbreak. Because if there's anything that Jesus shows us in his life, his death, and his triumph over death, is that happiness will lead to heartbreak. Passion leads to passion. So often in our lives, we try to avoid heartbreak. Do we not? We try to avoid it like it's the plague, and it's in that avoidance. It's that very avoidance that robs us of happiness because we fail to risk. We fail to risk deep friendships because of the looming threat that my heart can be broken. Judas and Jesus. Jesus knows where Judas is going to go with all of this, and yet Jesus risks the friendship even knowing that there is looming heartbreak, because love loves. You risk it anyways. Both are the only path to joy. Passion leads to passion. Let them marry each other. Heartbreak and happiness, they come together. But if we just stopped there and thought that these two in tension could bring us joy, we're missing out on another factor that changes everything, that breaks the tension between them, between the happiness, between the heartbreak, that multiplies the whole thing to a whole other level. And that's Jesus and the hope that he offers. Jesus is the factor known as hope. And so the formula can look like this. Does that look all right, Sean? Okay, great. Just making sure I've got the formula, the symbols right. If you take happiness and heartbreak and you add those together, and then you allow the hope of Jesus Christ to multiply those things, then suddenly we see that hope does this. There's so much more. There's so much more to life than what I see. There's so much more that God wants in the world. There's so much more than me. There's so much more than my time. This hope that Jesus shows in his life, that there's more, can transport you and me out of seeing the world as a tomb to seeing the world as a womb. See, Jesus offers this hope that suddenly we see the world as a womb, this abundantly creative, fertile field where dreams, God's dreams, come to reality. To suddenly see the world as it is, a beautiful, marvelous, creative work in process. As Paul says in Romans, that the whole creation groans in birth pangs. It's a work in process. I was driving home from Syracuse this week, and I was on the phone, hands-free, by the way, with a friend from the Midwest. And I was explaining to her where I was, that I was on the Thruway, on the most boring strip of Thruway that exists in New York State between Syracuse and Albany. And before I could correct myself, my stupidity suddenly came to mind. And she said, "Have you ever driven through Nebraska?" And then suddenly I saw my surroundings in a whole new way. That literally at that moment I was driving through part of a mountain that had been removed for us to pass safely through. And then I saw the lofty mountain grandeur. I saw the evergreens. I saw the colors of where we live. And there is a beauty that is surrounding all of us. And I suddenly realized that my surroundings didn't change. I changed. My eyes were opened, and I was deeply humbled in that moment. And that's where I was going to end the sermon. But luckily for you, I've got more. See, actually, originally I was thinking that was the complete equation, that this is the formula, that happiness and the heartbreak with the hope of Jesus Christ. But we've got to take it one step further. So yes, it equals joy, but there's something else that comes into this. See, until I had a chance to listen to where another pastor was going this morning with their sermon, you know us pastors, we can lose our prophetic voices every once in a while. We get a little bit of laryngitis every once in a while, but I think it's clearing up. Thanks to colleagues that are killing it in their own work. She reminded me that there's one more element to joy that I completely missed. And we could miss the whole thing if we just sit back and see our happiness and heartbreak and then just hope. No, we've got to divide the hard work that is now placed before us, because Jesus said the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the fields, and guess what? You, my friends, are the answer to that prayer. You and I were called to the hard work of healing the world's wounds. The wounds of catastrophic climate change, the wounds of racism, the wounds of nationalism, the wounds that are plaguing us right now. The world, yes, it's beautiful. Yes, there's much to be happy about. There's much to also be heartbroken about. But the hope in Jesus Christ, therefore, moves us into that call of hard work to make the joy complete, not just for us, but for those around us and for our children and our children's children. Just as devastating as the wildfires waging war on the canvas of California right now, there are wildfires raging in our hearts, in our nation, in our world. Wildfires of anger and hatred, violence, and they're vying for our souls, violence that's purposeful, that's coming out of every corner of the consumer news. And there's also that violence that's accidental, that heartbreaking byproduct that takes the lives of loved ones. But in order for the violence to come to an end, God needs us. God has no hands but our hands, a wise person once said. God needs us to take the totality of our happiness and heartbreak multiplied by the hope of Jesus Christ and divide it among ourselves, the hard work of making peace a reality. And we see the immensity of it and we say, how can we possibly make peace a reality on earth? Which then leads to another question, another tough question that someone said. Let's address the evil forces of this world. My gut response to that question was, we do that all too well when you think about it. We have given much too much of an audience to all these things. We know these things all too well. They're no longer in disguise. We've granted them permission by the principalities and powers of this world to now walk around in plain clothes. Racism, greed, malice, ambition, it's all right there out in the open. So it's not the evil forces that need more of an audience. It is our God-given capacity to access and unleash the holy forces within this world. For we're reminded that we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. We are reminded by the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the angel armies, that no weapon formed against us shall prosper. For the joy of the Lord is our strength. It's not going to be our succumbing. It's not going to be our lowering of our spiritual senses to resort to violence, to end violence. See, not even righteous, violent hearts can actually end violence. MLK reminds us that only light can drive out darkness. John reminds us that the true light has come into the world and that darkness cannot overcome it. So yes, we have to add in that hard work. We have to see that it's time once again to live into our true callings, to let God put flesh on these dry bones, to be the shepherd's children that stand up to the mighty kings until they finally bend their knees and say to the people everywhere, listen to what I say. Pray for peace, people everywhere. Listen to what I say. The child, sleeping in the night, he has brought us goodness and light. He has brought us goodness and light. Because it's not angry rhetoric that's going to do the trick. The weapon we wield is the sword of the Spirit, the light of the world, the hope that has come into the world, and that brings us full circle. It will be joy that's overflowing in our hearts, the happiness, the heartbreak, the hope, the hard work of practicing peace patiently. Practicing peace patiently. If you're like me and you've made mistakes and you already hear the lion roaring and the accuser roaring and saying, you have done this, you have not made peace a reality. the enemy has come to remind you of your past, it's time we remind him of his future. Because God is here with new mercies for you and for me this morning, new loving kindness, new mercy for this day. And God is saying to you this morning, you've got this, and I've got you. So let's do this patiently, striving, turning toward rewiring our mind and heart and focusing on those things that we saw and heard from Paul in his letter to the Philippians. Think on these things. And this, my friends, is really hard work. It is. It's the hardest work that we can ever be employed to. And it can only be accomplished. The joy of the Lord is our strength. You can start now. I can start now. You can ask God this morning for the joy and the hope that comes from him to say, today is a new day. It's a new day of mercies. And from this point forward, I am turning toward making a peace in my heart, making peace a reality to those around me. And you might want to start practicing now, because Thanksgiving is coming on Thursday and you never know who's going to be at the table with you. Go ahead, laugh at that. May you be an instrument of God's peace this week. May you be an instrument of peace and hope and joy for those that are surrounded by a table that reminds us that we are to give thanks to God for life, because life is alive and God wants you to have joy complete in your heart. May it be so. I pray these things for you.